Hello, everybody, and welcome back down here to the Gamer's Den. With me, your host, Jordan, your master of lore and storyteller extraordinaire. We are going to be keeping on going with our Cloak and Dagger series that we've got going right now. Let's go ahead and just dive right into it, shall we? Now, last time around, just to give a brief recap, I talked a bit about some of the more common mistakes that are made when running these sorts of clandestine Cloak and Dagger, skulduggery, backstabbing sort of kind of styled campaigns, and also a bit more about how to make things a bit more manageable and realistic, how these clandestine organizations can function, in particular with how they will it's an easy way for them to mask their activities is by embedding themselves within other larger organizations. But with that said, there are plenty of organizations that can engage in clandestine activities. Actually, just about every organization you can think of potentially can do this to one degree or another. It just what it comes down to is, like what I mentioned before, is what are their goals? What are their objectives? How do they, what their goals are and their objectives are will do a lot to dictate what exactly they do to meet those goals, to achieve those objectives. It's really going to depend quite a bit, and even similar organizations will have varying methods and tactics and strategies that they will employ in order to meet those goals. But for now, let's go ahead and just get rolling into the different types of organizations. Some of the more common ones that you can make use of across all different sorts of games. Now, again, very much this is setting dependent. If you're playing a game like Shadowrun, well, you're already doing a lot of clandestine, skullduggery oriented type of things, playing as Shadowrunners, working for various crime organizations, the various metacorporations, some governments, or different think tanks and private entities all over the place. So, and you're carrying out acts of espionage, assassination, extraction against forces that have quite a bit more power than you, but have to be careful in how they flex that power. So, again, Shadowrun, very much so the type of game that deals with this sort of thing, this sort of clandestine activity, pretty regularly. That's not to say things can't go more conventional warfare where there's a lot of firepower and autocannons going off, anti-air fire blasting away, missiles being launched, submarines firing torpedoes, death, destruction, and mayhem on a modern battlefield, epically sized scale. But that's not typically what you see, and truth be told, the game's not set up with its mechanics to really run that well. I don't think many games are. I mean, I'm getting off topic here. I apologize. Suffice it to say, some games are more set up and oriented around clandestine activities than others. This is more for how to run those games just a little bit better, a little bit more thought and consideration, or for the other games that are a bit more broadly set, like D20 Modern, Pathfinder, and the like. This is something to help you run the or set up your stories within these games and run them a bit more efficiently, and I hesitate to use the word correctly, but to run them with a certain amount of appropriate mystique, giving them that feel of something shadowy, sinister, subtle. It's you're working with the dagger, not the axe. Anyways, so the types of organizations that you can employ in these Cloak and Dagger styled campaigns. First off, the most obvious one is government organizations. Governments, city-states, empires, kingdoms, republics. Any of these can and will engage in clandestine activities, shadowy back alley deals, and the like. And I mean, it's not hard to see why. And these are massive organizations. They need to be able to use political intrigue amongst their own internal factions as well as outside forces. They're going to be engaging in diplomacy, spy work. They're going to use every avenue possible in order to maintain an advantage for themselves. Now, how exactly they achieve these goals depends a little bit, and we can refer somewhat to the alignment system on this one. For those of you who don't know or have just joined us, or if you need a recap, the alignment system is generally a broad, rough outlook that a character or organization may have in role playing games as far as things go on the law or chaos axis, which has neutral right in the middle of it all, or good and evil, which again has neutral right in the middle of that. And you combine these three different alignments on the law and chaos and good and evil axis to kind of set up how your character looks at things. A lawful good city state or government will be law oriented, but the laws are set up to be a genuine benefit to their people. They Not every law will always apply evenly, but generally the leadership, the general outlook for the government and its numerous internal factions or organizations will typically have this broad lawful good mindset. And to give you an example of lawful good, let's go with I would say, think like your Steve Rogers or your King Arthur kind of characters. They are moral, upright. They try to rule even-handedly, and they try to hand down fair but good sentences towards people, good edicts. They try to genuinely build and uplift their people and help their lands prosper. That's the kind of thing you'd be looking at there versus, say, a lawful evil organization, a lawful evil empire. Definitely still law oriented, but the laws are harsh. They're draconian. They are outright cruel in some cases. The best example I can think of for this was, don't recall the character's name, but it's from Sweeney Todd, the Demon Barber of Fleet Street, the judge in the movie with Johnny Depp. The judge character there's a particular scene where he's handing down a sentence where it's a repeat offender, and he's talking about how he can't believe that this person is back up here before him after his leniency last time for theft, stealing, if I remember, stealing food out of the market, and so he sentenced him to hang by the neck until dead. And the camera pulls back to show the courtroom, and the person being sentenced is a 8-10-year-old boy. I was like, that's pretty goddamn harsh. That's awful. But it was well within the letter of the law, presumably, and the judge, the magistrate, had every right to hand down that sentence. Clearly, he's a man that doesn't obey the laws himself, but the point is, it's his job to enforce those laws on others. Lawful evil societies and organizations, the leadership, the rules are for other people. The rules get handed down and enforced on the hierarchy for the next person down the rung in power. The highest authority is the one that makes the laws, so clearly the laws don't necessarily apply to them. They can, depending on the person's mindset. Like I said, alignment systems are pretty broad, but they'll work their way down in in an increasingly controlled manner. So the king, the emperor, they can hand down whatever edicts they want and not have to really worry about obeying that themselves. The next people down all the way have to. But his advisors, his generals, all the people of his inner court, they definitely have way more leeway because it's their job to take the edicts from their king or emperor and pass them down to the people underneath of them. And it goes on further and further and further down, with everybody further and further down the ladder, typically being harsher and harsher and harsher with the people underneath of them because they want to be efficient, they want to have everything neat, orderly, and tidy. They want to seek whatever leverage they can over their peers or their betters and try to supplant them and install themselves as a competitor in the next rung up in the power chain. I could probably go on for a while about this, but this gives you an idea on how the alignments may work within the broader context of organizations like governments or any of the other organizations I'm about to bring up further down through the video here. So, how these various governments and city states go about achieving their goals, like I said, depends a bit on their alignments. A lawful good city state may still engage in clandestine activities and espionage, but bear in mind, their mindset is going to be that it's for the benefit of their state and their people. They're not seeking to do harm, but it'd be foolish of them to assume that nobody's going to be undertaking spy work against them. Nobody's going to be attempting to assassinate their leaders or steal their documents, any intel, plans, strategies, locations where they may have their forces oriented. So, the clandestine activities they may be undertaking may look a bit more defensive, counter spy work, intercepting assassins, intercepting saboteurs. An organization that has a lawful good mindset will be less likely to engage in assassination themselves, but in the interest of defending their people, their leadership, and keeping their nation or city state intact, they may send out a team to, well, extract people who have engaged in crimes against the state. They may extract them and bring them in and process them and hold them so that they can be tried fairly with whatever evidence that they may have gathered and have on hand. A lawful evil organization, a city-state, will totally and absolutely engage in assassination, blackmail, bribery, all sorts of underhanded and dirty conniving tricks, and feel free to make use of them liberally if you have this sort of city or nation state in mind. But a government or city state or empire is only one of many sorts of organizations. A government may have a great deal of resources on hand, or they may have comparatively very little. But for many nations, compared to the other organizations that may exist within them, even if on the larger global scale, your city-state has relatively little power in comparison to their various neighbors and cousins within their own borders. Typically, they will hold a great deal more resources, influence, and power over the constituent organizations that they have in their borders. But this is only one facet of this. The next, and I'd say another fairly obvious clandestine organization, would be the military. Now, for the most part, most militaries are an arm of the state. They are part of the governmental organization. And that's typically the case, but for the purposes of these games and these campaigns, you can treat them as a separate section. They're two organizations that will typically work closely together, or depending, they may be one and the same. You may have a military run and led state. Very easily could be a lawful evil oriented kind of state, or you could argue that say King Arthur's his kingdom from fables and legend, myths, and stories is very much a military-run state, considering that, well, the king is a battle-hardened knight and commander. His inner court is made up of several of his knights and generals and advisors. The way the feudal system works, definitely the kingdom could be considered a military state-run government, or you could argue that anyways. Whether or not you actually do that, it's up to you, really. Depends on the context and what exactly it is you're going for. But that should make another point right here. You can kind of mix and match a lot of these. There has to be a certain logic to it in order for it to make sense, but you can mix and match different organizations in order to get them to function with what you have in mind for the story that you have at hand. But the military is definitely an organization that will engage in clandestine activities. They have They have intel on their movements, on enemy movements. They want to gather all that intel as much as possible. They employ special forces, special operations units. More modern settings, you will definitely have snipers and various kinds of marksmen that can, well, use their abilities and skills in order to destabilize an enemy's command structure by retiring them early with, using the 50 caliber persuasion is always fairly effective, usually fairly effective. But I digress. A military organization can absolutely engage in clandestine activities, and as I mentioned before, a military organization is typically a function or an arm of the state. It doesn't always have to be. You can make various mercenary companies a military organization that will engage in clandestine activities. Different bandits, raiders, pirates can be military organizations that engage in these sorts of clandestine activities, and you can make use of these pretty readily. The next, and again, another fairly obvious one, organized crime. Organized crime, various criminal organizations absolutely engage in clandestine activities. Now, they're more of what you might call an open secret. It's like everybody knows about the mafia, the various mafias out there, the Yakuza, the Italian mob, the Russian mafia, MS-13, all these various organizations. But even though they're an open secret, their activities are definitely a bit, well, definitely a bit more clandestine. Smuggling, kidnapping, removing their rivals. Although some organizations may be a bit more messy about it than others, they still will engage in bribery, blackmail, suppressing evidence, trying to get rid of or intimidating witnesses that may be testifying to crimes. These are definitely something that I would call clandestine activities. Now, everybody knows that they do it, but they're pretty good at hiding the evidence or getting people to not talk about it, ruling typically through fear or goodwill. Which avenue they take, well, like I said, that just depends on how you want to set up these organizations. Another organization that you can make use of, and it's again, a lot of these are fairly obvious, but any sort of spy network. Take the CIA, for example. It's another open secret. Everybody knows about the CIA, the Department of Homeland Security. These various organizations definitely undertake clandestine activities. They engage in spy work, stealing intel. They assist with diplomatic missions, assassinations, removals and extractions of valuable personnel, creating assets in foreign territory, enemy territory, or even creating assets on their own home-based soil. These organizations definitely can, again, function as arms of the state, and typically do, but you can always make rogue spy networks, rogue spy organizations, their own separate little entities, the type of organization that works for everybody and nobody at the same time, entirely mercenary in their activities, in the spy work that they engage in, selling off their intel to the highest bidders, selling off their services to the highest bidders. Or maybe they're not all that mercenary. They have a burning ideal. They have their own passion. They have their own goals and ideas and agenda. They may be working entirely for themselves towards this whatever this nebulous goal or idea their leadership may have in mind. Now, how all these groups interact with each other, well, that just depends on the story you want to tell. And this is by no means the only list of organizations that you can make use of out there. Shadowrun gives us plenty of other examples with various think tanks, various mega corporations. Corporations definitely can engage in their own levels of clandestine activities, their own bits of espionage. Corporate espionage is definitely a fairly fascinating thing. It definitely happens. They definitely compete with one another, and some less scrupulous companies do try to edge out one another by stealing ideas, uh, trying to get their own products out ahead of their competition in order to beat them to the market. The strategy doesn't always work. Sometimes it's better to take their time to make a finished, refined product, something that just absolutely wows people and works great. Rushed products can have flaws that get overlooked. But again, what you want exactly just depends on the story that you want to tell and how these various groups go about achieving their ends and their aims and goals. Really, again, just depends entirely on what it is you want. And we haven't even touched on the subject of having sub factions within these factions. I mean, look at our own governmental system. We have Republicans, Democrats, Libertarians, Tea Party people. We have the Bull Moose Party. Well, had the Bull Moose Party. If they're still around, they're certainly not as loud or as active since Teddy Roosevelt's no longer with us. But these factions definitely all compete with one another. They are a separate sub factions within the larger faction of the U.S. government, but they can engage in their own clandestine activities with one another. They have their own backroom deals where they try to get their bills and various laws passed, or whatever motions that they have in progress blocking other bills. They have different powers and abilities available to them in comparison to what you might find with other government organizations. But these sub organizations add a little bit more character and flair and a bit more depth and reality to your larger governments and states. Not everybody agrees, not everybody has the same ideas, especially when you're looking at something with such a huge national scale to it. I mean, even if you scale it down to, say, a city state like how Venice used to be way back when. The city of Venice had plenty of their own sub factions. Hell, the Italian peninsula with their various city states there, they definitely were in competition with each other, but the various merchant and banking factions within each city definitely were very much so going against one another and grinding each other's gears a bit, and it led to a lot of fierce fighting and, in some cases, bloodletting between these various groups and factions. All these cities were definitely famous for employing different mercenary groups, and you had great minds and great thinkers like Machiavelli that lived during this time, or the great Renaissance artists, painters, and sculptors. Such a very rich time that you can use to draw off of for building various city-state organizations with their own internal component organizations and structures and power bases that compete with one another, compete with the various city-states. You can make this incredibly complicated, obviously, if you want to, but coming up with even just a couple of sub-factions within your larger city-state factions, or your military factions, or the various criminal organizations, or what have you, can do a lot to add a bit of depth, and thinking about the various organizations that you can already create and employ for your campaigns, especially if you're engaging in this sort of cloak and dagger skulduggery, will do nothing but add depth to your game. Just give it a little bit of thought, a little bit of time, and you'll be absolutely golden. And if you get tired of it, that you can always revert to just outright warfare or send the characters back out adventuring. At some point, powerful people are going to get sick of having these incredibly capable people around. It's only a matter of time before they turn on them or uncover something they're not supposed to. So send them out to the front lines or send them out adventuring. In either case, I hope you all have fun. Thank you all very much for your time. I have been your host, Jordan, your master of lore and storyteller extraordinaire. If you enjoyed today's video, please consider giving me a like. And if you've been enjoying the content I've been putting out so far, maybe go ahead and click over on the subscribe button over there. And if you do subscribe, click that bell icon so that way you get notified the next time I upload more videos here to the Gamer's Den. Once again, I've been your host, Jordan. Thank you all for your time. You have yourselves a good night.